This is a screenshot video in the contracts course, and it's the second screenshot video on the topic of consideration. And as I note at the top of the page that I have up on the screen, we're going to be identifying and giving some examples of two concepts that some have called problem areas in consideration. One concept is past consideration, and the second concept is the pre-existing legal duty rule. And it would be useful for you perhaps to pause the video and make certain that you have in front of you the definition that I have put up with the first video regarding consideration. And when we get to the topic of past consideration, we note that the definition of consideration itself requires the need for something given in exchange for the promise. So if nothing is given in exchange for the promise, then there can be no legally sufficient consideration. And I'll talk about the example. I mentioned it's in the book. I know you don't have the book, but it's a simple illustration and we can talk about it. But let me give you an example that's not in the notes before we get into the example about Fred and the elderly couple and Daniel. So I'm recording this in my law office, so I'm thinking of an example where let's assume that my assistant, who does everything for me, has just done such a terrific job in a given month that at the end of the month I say to that person, call payroll and tell them to put $200 more in your next paycheck because you've done a terrific job this past month. I'd like to give you a bonus. And her response is, well, thanks, that's great. So now what happens is, and this is hypothetical because if I promised someone a bonus, believe me, I would give it to them. But let's assume that in the hypothetical, she comes to me when she gets her next paycheck and says, payroll didn't put an extra $200 into my paycheck. And my response is, well, I called them up after we talked and I rescinded the order because I just can't afford it. Now, I think, again, that would be, from a business and perhaps even human perspective, a terrible thing to do. But the question is, could she sue me on the ground that I promised to give her $200? And the answer is not successfully, because my promise to pay her $200 was for work she had done in the past. And therefore, since it was work she had done for me in the past, there was nothing given in exchange for the promise. Nothing given in exchange for the promise. And so that's an example of past consideration. And I guess what we could say then at this point is past consideration really is not legally sufficient consideration, and we just want to be clear about that. And we can next get into this example in the book that you don't have, but again, it's a very simple example. So the facts are Fred's son Daniel was taken in by an elderly couple. That's what they used in the book. And when Daniel the kid, was returning home during a snowstorm. And so when he arrived at home, meaning the couple had already taken him in and cared for him, he told his father that the elderly couple, his father is Fred, told his father that the elderly couple had provided him with food and shelter. And so Fred writes the elderly couple a letter, and in the letter he promises to pay them $500, and the elderly couple apparently wrote back saying, well, we accept your generosity. Then what happens in this hypothetical, Fred and Daniel have some kind of a disagreement, and Fred did not follow through on his promise to the couple. So the question becomes whether Fred's promise to the couple was supported by legally sufficient consideration. And if we think about it, Fred's promise to the couple is like my promise to my assistant, where I promised to pay her money for something she had already done. Fred's promise was to pay this elderly couple for something they had already done. So we have the same answer. There's not legally sufficient consideration because the couple gave Fred nothing in exchange for the promise. Fred's promise was solely predicated on conduct that had already been performed, and here's the key word, before Fred made his promise. So that's one, when we say problem area, it's an area where intuitively, perhaps we think the promise should be honored. Perhaps ethically, we think the promise should be honored. But the law of contract tells us that if nothing is given in exchange for the promise, and the promise is predicated on something someone has already done, then it's not going to be a legally enforceable promise, because it's not going to be a contractual promise, because it's not supported by legally sufficient consideration. Our next concept, which is different than past consideration, is something known as the pre-existing legal duty rule. And when we focus again on the working definition of consideration, we see that a promise or act, one way we have legally sufficient consideration is if the promise or act is given in exchange for a promise that was not already legally required. In other words, if there was already a legal requirement to make the promise or perform the act, then there is no legally sufficient consideration. This is known as the pre-existing legal duty rule. And I note that in the book, but again, you don't need the book to understand this example, is if a law enforcement person provides information leading to the capture of a criminal, that person is not going to be able to collect a reward because they were already under a legal duty to capture the criminal. There's an old case, again, this is not in the notes, but there's an old case from Atlantic City, New Jersey. I think it was back in the 1920s. And so this wealthy widow owns a lot of jewelry, and it was taken from her. So she posts a reward for the return of her jewelry. And a detective working for the Atlantic City Police comes across the jewelry in his position as a detective, and he returns the jewelry to the widow. I'm certain she was very pleased, but she wouldn't pay the detective the reward. My guess is, since she was wealthy, she wasn't going to do anything without talking to an attorney, and the attorney said, you don't owe this person a reward because he was already under the legal duty to find and return your jewelry if he could. And another way of saying it, he already had the pre-existing legal duty to do what he claims he did in exchange for the promise. And there's another example. Again, I say in the book, it's not. We don't have the book available, but the illustration is very complete here in the notes. So we have this person who owns some land, and they enter into a contract with a contractor, and in the book, the contractor is known as Shade, to build a structure on the land in return for the owner, whose name is Bernstein, her promise to pay the contractor Shade a certain price. So now they enter into the agreement, and Shade begins to perform on the contract. After he begins to perform on the contract, he goes to the owner and he demands that she pay an extra amount of money because of inflation and a recent hike in the price of materials. She reluctantly agrees to pay the additional sum. but when it comes time to pay off the final bill, she refuses to pay the extra amount of money she promised to pay him. So let's just stop here. If we look at her contract, Bernstein's contract with Shade, we don't have numbers, but let me just use a number. He promises to build this structure for, let's say, $20,000. Maybe it's a garage. Maybe it's a part of what they call today a granny flat. Somebody is putting an addition on their home for parents or whatever. Now, he then, at that point, when that contract is formed, he has the legal duty to build the structure for the $20,000. And so the question becomes whether there is legally sufficient consideration to support her promise to pay the additional sum of money. Well, the answer is no, because the contractor, Shade, under the initial agreement, had a legal duty to construct the house for the agreed upon price. So in exchange for her promise to pay him an additional amount of money, he only promised to perform an act he was already legally required to perform. Or as I say, in other words, he had a pre-existing legal duty to build the house for the original contract price, and therefore her promise to pay the additional money wasn't enforceable. And again, if we just stop a little bit, what we can see, if we think about it, we ought not to feel, I don't think, sorry for Shade, because inflation is a fact of life. Prices go up, and materials go up. And he could have easily, by the way, covered himself in his original agreement by building into it a provision that if the price of materials were to rise, he could increase and she would have agreed at that point to pay the cost of the price hike. But that wasn't part of their contract. He assumed the risk, in other words, that there might be a hike in materials, and he was still bound to perform the contract under his original promise. There's an exception to the pre-existing legal duty rule, and the exception is if there are unforeseen difficulties that do not involve the types of risk ordinarily assumed in business. And again, I reference a problem in the book, and we don't have the book, but the example is that a general contractor promised to pay a subcontractor additional money because the general contractor encountered unforeseen difficulties. There was problems, they were building some kind of tunnel or something like that, and they ran into all kinds of underground water problems that wouldn't have been foreseen, and therefore the promise to pay an additional money based on the unforeseen difficulties is an exception to the pre-existing legal duty rule. So we'll conclude this recording at this point.